this session. My name is McDaniel. I am finishing up my degree at KGST, hopefully finishing up by taking my comps in December and completing that. I also serve as the preaching minister at the Westlake Church of Christ in Wentzville, Missouri. I've been there for about 2 years, was in Montgomery for about 7 years before that. Today I'll be presenting a condensed version of my essay, The Divine Spirit in Pre-Christian Jewish Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha. And Brother Gleaves told me that I have extended time because the other presenter is not here, so if I go over time, you can throw the tomatoes at him. All right, so let's start with the introduction here, and I'll just be basically reading through the essay. The literature of the so-called intertestamental or Second Temple period bridges the gap between the Old Testament and the New Testament. While the New Testament depends on the Old Testament for its base theology, the New Testament writers were seemingly not unaffected by their cultural and religious environment, for example, Second Temple Judaism, Greco-Roman philosophy. The present study investigates the development of Jewish pneumatology in the intertestamental period by isolating references to the divine spirit in the pre-Christian Jewish Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha. Agreements with and deviations from the Old Testament description of the Spirit of God are examined and synthesized to determine their influence, if any, on early Christian pneumatology. The study does not define the Spirit of God in the Septuagint and the Dead Sea Scrolls or in other post-Christian literature, for example, later apocryphal and pseudepigraphal Jewish documents, Philo, Josephus, and the Talmud. Post-Christian literature is excluded because of the potential for Christian influence. The study begins with a brief summary of the divine spirit in the Old Testament and then examines pertinent passages in the Apocrypha and the Pseudepigrapha. The data are then consolidated and compared with the New Testament. Though the pneumatologies of the Old Testament, the Apocrypha, the Pseudepigrapha, and the New Testament are varied, sometimes even within themselves, the overall development demonstrates an emerging knowledge, or might we say progressive revelation, of the divine spirit, culminating in the New Testament. The intertestamental understanding of the Spirit of God reveals continuity with the Old Testament, yet accommodates to Hellenistic expression or language. The divine spirit in the Old Testament. The Old Testament, having been composed over a period of about 1,000 years, conveys a variety of understandings or expressions for the Spirit of God. The Hebrew word ruach is typically used of the spirits of people and of God, though its semantic range includes other concepts as well, for example, wind or breath. Some scholars, Montag, Peters, assume an evolutionary progression of the lexeme from breath to spirit. However, the lexical development of ruach in Israel seems to differ from the rest of the ancient Near East. Ernest DeWitt Burton summarizes as follows, quote, "One might naturally conjecture that ruach denoting spirit was a later development from its use to denote the breath, and that its application to the Spirit of God was an outgrowth of its use with reference to the spirit of man. Unless, however, the order of development of meanings was widely different from the order of appearance in extant literature, or the judgment of modern scholars as to the order of the literature is wide of the mark, the meaning spirit came before breath and its application to God earlier than man," end quote. If spirit is essential to the Jewish usage of ruach, the Old Testament understanding of the divine spirit ought to be given priority over that of other ancient Near Eastern sources. The Spirit of God is introduced in Genesis 1:2, though the meaning of ruach therein is contested, and is closely associated with the creation and ordering of the cosmos. Quote, "The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters," end quote, Genesis 1:2 ESV. The divine spirit manifests the presence of the transcendent God and overpowers the chaos of the primordial universe. See Hildebrandt. Likewise, the animation of Adam and Eve by means of the divine breath implies that the spirit was the source and means of life. See Genesis 2:7 especially. Eduard Schweitzer affirms that, quote, "In the last resort, all life must be traced back to the Spirit, including nature with all its fascinating variety and all its glory, as well as our own human senses and faculties," end quote. The people of God in the Old Testament thus desired that the Spirit of God reside among them as evidence of the presence and providence of Yahweh. The rest of the Old Testament builds on the foundation of Genesis. The Spirit of God represents Yahweh on earth, usually among his people and often specifically in the tabernacle and the temple. See Montag. For instance, the parallelism of Psalm 139:7 equates the Spirit of Yahweh with his presence or his face. Likewise, while the expression Holy Spirit is only used 3 times in the Old Testament with reference to the divine Spirit, Psalm 51:11, Isaiah 63:10, and verse 11, compare that with Daniel 4 and 5 as well. Each of these instances conveys divine immanence. The presence of the Spirit also manifests in divine wisdom, inspired revelation or prophecy, and supernatural blessings. See Cage and Montag. So by the end of the Old Testament, the Jews longed for the eschatological outpouring of the Spirit. See specifically Isaiah 32, Ezekiel 36 and 37, and Joel 2. The Spirit of God in the Old Testament manifests divine power and represents Yahweh himself, his inner nature, and his personal being. The Jews did not differentiate the Spirit of God from God himself. See especially Pitts and Pollinger, 159 and 162. Israel thus associated the Spirit of God with the presence of Yahweh and his associated blessings. Moving on to the divine Spirit in the Apocrypha. The theology of the Spirit in the Apocrypha is almost certainly consistent with that of the Old Testament. E.Y. Mullins affirms that, quote, in the Old Testament Apocrypha, the references to the Spirit are nearly always merely echoes of a long past age when the Spirit was active among men, end quote. Yet, an examination of the apocryphal literature shows the possible influence of outside, that is, non-Jewish sources. For instance, Gary Cage assumes that Persian or Zoroastrian theology influenced the pneumatology of the Apocrypha. A weakness I see in Cage's argument is that the oldest Zoroastrian writings are still post-Christian, thus the influence could be reversed. Eduard Schweitzer contends that Greek philosophy, more than Persian theology, influenced the intertestamental writings. Regardless, the Hebrew understanding of the divine Spirit was seemingly still foreign to the ancient non-Jews. The Greek word pneuma was primarily used to express the Hebrew ruach. That the Apocrypha adopts pneuma to identify the divine Spirit does not seem to affect its pneumatology. The Jews felt compelled to redefine pneuma per the Old Testament. See especially Isaacs and Schweitzer. To identify the similarities and differences between the Spirit of God in the Old Testament and in the Apocrypha, references to the divine Spirit are examined and synthesized below. The apocryphal writings that reference the Spirit of God are Sirach, Baruch, and the Wisdom of Solomon. Number 1, Sirach. The word pneuma occurs 8 times in Sirach, but likely refers to the divine Spirit in only 3 of these. Quoting from 39:6, 48:12, and 48:24, all from the New Revised Standard Version, says, if the great Lord is willing, he will be filled with the spirit of understanding. He will pour forth words of wisdom of his own and give thanks to the Lord in prayer. When Elijah was enveloped in the whirlwind, Elisha was filled with his spirit. He performed twice as many signs and marvels with every utterance of his mouth. Never in his lifetime did he tremble before any ruler, nor could anyone intimidate him at all. By his dauntless spirit, Isaiah saw the future and comforted the mourners in Zion. The parallelism of Sirach 39:6 acknowledges correspondence between the spirit of understanding and words of wisdom, in keeping with the Old Testament wisdom tradition. That this is an explicit reference to the divine Spirit is debatable, but Sirach always acknowledges God as the ultimate source of knowledge. See especially verses 7 and 8. The subsequent references, Sirach 48:12 and 24, affirm the prophetic activity of the Spirit. Elisha receives the spirit of Elijah, performing miracles and withstanding opposition. Isaiah predicts the future and so encourages the mourners of Zion. The question to be raised, did Elijah and Isaiah perform miracles and prophesy by the power of their own human spirits or by the Spirit of God? John R. Levinson assumes a disconnect between the Old Testament and Sirach at this point, that the human spirits of Elijah and Isaiah are in view. Yet the Spirit of God may still be the referent, see Burton. The Old Testament similarly blurs the line between the human and divine spirit. 1, the divine spirit created the human spirit, so there's continuity, and 2, the divine spirit fills the prophet, allowing him to speak for God. 2, Judith. The reference to the Spirit of God in Judith echoes the Old Testament. Quote, let all your creatures serve you, for you spoke and they were made. You sent forth your Spirit and it formed them. There is none that can resist your voice. Jude 16:14, the Revised Standard Version. Pitts and Pollinger suggest that the agency of the Spirit, not necessarily his personality, is evident here. Since the passage does not seem to add anything to Old Testament pneumatology, the passage does not seem to add anything to Old Testament pneumatology, since the link between the creative breath of God and his Spirit is well established in the Hebrew Bible. 3. Wisdom of Solomon. The Wisdom of Solomon refers to the divine Spirit more than any other apocryphal work. George T. Montag concludes that, quote, the understanding of the Spirit in wisdom tradition reaches its high point in the Wisdom of Solomon. Its author does not hesitate to personify God's wisdom in most daring ways, one of which is to identify wisdom with the Spirit of God. End quote. The author of Wisdom uses pneuma 20 times, and as many as half of these refer to the divine Spirit. The opening section of Wisdom recognizes the effects of the Spirit of God on the human spirit, namely the result of wisdom and holiness. See Wisdom 1:5-8. The Wisdom of Solomon also personifies wisdom as the Spirit. Compare that even with Sirach 24. The indwelling Spirit reforms the human spirit. To those who ask, God gives the Spirit of wisdom, namely his Holy Spirit. See Wisdom 7:7 and Wisdom 9:17. The Spirit, wisdom, is assigned divine qualities, creative and sustaining power, holiness and purity, eternity and omnipresence. In Wisdom 7:21-8:1. The Spirit or breath of God punishes the wicked because, quote, his immortal spirit is in all things. 12:1. That the Wisdom of Solomon envisions the divine Spirit as immanent likely echoes the Old Testament, though Greek, possibly Stoic influences are possible. See 15:11 and 16. Wisdom recognizes, in continuity with the Old Testament tradition, that the human spirit belongs to God and returns to him imperishable. God especially loves souls that imitate his Spirit. See 11:26. Summary. The Apocrypha evidences continuity with the Old Testament. Possible influences from Hellenistic philosophy, for example Platonism, Stoicism, do not seem to have affected the pneumatology of the Apocrypha. The apocryphal writers, especially the author of the Wisdom of Solomon, used the terminology of the Greeks, specifically pneuma, but maintained Jewish or Old Testament traditions. Next, the divine Spirit in the Pseudepigrapha. The pseudepigraphal writings references to the Spirit of God are more abundant than the apocryphal. Gary Cage notes, however, that, quote, all the normal Old Testament usages of the Spirit are found in the Jewish Pseudepigrapha, end quote. To identify the similarities and differences between the divine Spirit in the Pseudepigrapha and the Old Testament, the references to the Spirit of God in the Pseudepigrapha are examined and synthesized. These are addressed in assumed chronological order, and the dates of the pseudepigraphal books are determined by comparison of Charlesworth, Ferguson, and Cage. The following books, referencing the Spirit of God, are considered in the present study: the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs, Jubilees, 1 Enoch, and the Psalms of Solomon. The Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs contain Christian additions, but much is still pre-Christian. See Charlesworth, Volume 1, 777-78. The obvious interpolations are ignored in the present study. Joseph and Asenath, the Sibylline oracles, and the martyrdom and ascension of Isaiah are excluded from the study because the pre-Christian and the post-Christian cannot be easily distinguished. The Apocalypse of Zephaniah is excluded, even though it contains pre-Christian elements, because the single reference to Holy Spirit or Spirit in Apocalypse 1:1 seems to refer to the angelic messenger and not the Spirit of God. Looking at the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs. In the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs, the following testaments mention the Spirit of God: Simeon, Levi, Judah, and Benjamin. The Testament of Simeon associates the goodness of Joseph with his possession of the divine Spirit. See Simeon 4:4. The Spirit of understanding of the Lord unveils the wickedness of the world to Levi. 2:3. The Spirit of truth and the Spirit of deceit wait for people, and the Spirit of understanding resides among them in the Testament of Judah. 20:1-2. Several Christian editions staged as messianic predictions are found in Testament of Judah 24. References to the Spirit therein are borrowed from the Old Testament, but impossible to separate from Christian interpolations. See 24:2 and 3. The Testament of Benjamin states that the presence of the Spirit cleanses the heart of the wise, Benjamin 8:3, but destroys the wicked, 9:3. The reference to the Spirit in Benjamin 9:3 is probably a Christian interpolation, which limits its relevance to this study. Jubilees. Jubilees refers to the Divine Spirit 4 times, 5:8, 25:14, 31:12, and 45. The first occurrence is a quotation of Genesis 6:8 and adds nothing to Old Testament pneumatology. The second, however, develops the prophetic function of the Divine Spirit, who is called the Spirit of Truth, which compares well with John 14:17. The Ethiopic manuscript of Jubilees translates the phrase as a Holy Spirit, see Charlesworth, Volume 2, 105, and Cage 187. The Spirit descends upon the mouth of Rebekah to direct the blessing of Jacob. A similar expression is used later, the Spirit of prophecy, to describe the revelatory work of the Divine Spirit, Jubilees 31:12. Compare that also with the New Testament in Revelation 19:10. Finally, the Spirit of Joseph is said to be the product of the presence of the Spirit of the Lord in him, Jubilees 40 and verse 5. Compare that to Genesis 41:38 and 39. First Enoch. References to the Spirit are common in Enoch, yet many do not seem to be directly tied to the Spirit of God. The expression, the Spirit, the Lord of Spirits, is ubiquitous and probably refers to Yahweh, though the Spirit of God or the Messiah may also be the reference. 1 Enoch 49:3 notes that the Spirit, the Lord of Spirits, possesses all spirits, but that he also has a spirit, quote, and in him dwells the Spirit of wisdom, and the Spirit which gives insight, and the Spirit of understanding and of might, and the Spirit of those who have fallen asleep in righteousness. 1 Enoch 49:3. If the Divine Spirit is under consideration, 1 Enoch 49:3 continues the Old Testament wisdom tradition. Additionally, in progression of the Old Testament prophetic tradition, the Lord of Spirits receives the Spirit of righteousness as he sits on his throne. See 62 and verse 2. The wicked in the days of Noah deny the Spirit of the Lord, Enoch 67:10. Enoch predicts the future when he receives the outpouring of the Spirit, 91:1. And while the alterations from the Old Testament are evident in Enoch, the connection between the Spirit and wisdom and prophecy and Yahweh himself simply repeats established themes of the Old Testament. Psalms of Solomon. The Psalms of Solomon only mention the Spirit of God twice. The psalmist first echoes Isaiah 11:1-4, associating the Spirit with the Messiah, quote, and relying upon his God throughout his days he will not stumble, for God will make him mighty by means of his Holy Spirit, and wise by means of the Spirit of understanding with strength and righteousness. And the blessing of the Lord will be with him. He will be strong and stumble not, end quote. The Holy Spirit and the Spirit of understanding may refer to the Messiah's own Spirit, but the apparent Old Testament intertext suggests that the Divine Spirit is in view. The Old Testament understanding of the Spirit of God is not altered. The psalmist next predicts that the Lord's anointed will chasten Israel, quote, in the spirit of wisdom and righteousness and strength, end quote, 18:7. The Messianic connection suggests that the Divine Spirit is the referent of the phrase, though the focus is more generic and instrumental than the former. In sum, the Pseudepigrapha evidences continuity with Old Testament pneumatology. The prophetic function of the Divine Spirit is emphasized, especially in Messianic passages. The eschatological role of the Spirit is borrowed from the Old Testament, but is particularized in a Messianic figure. The Christian, quote-unquote, corruption of the Pseudepigrapha unfortunately veils much of its pneumatology. Summary and conclusions. The purpose of this study has been to isolate the references to the Spirit of God in the pre-Christian Jewish Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha to ascertain the similarities and differences between the Old Testament and the intertestamental pneumatologies. The assumption has been that these similarities and or differences would provide insight into the background of the New Testament. The study began with a brief overview of the Spirit of God in the Old Testament and then examined selected apocryphal and pseudepigraphal passages dealing with the Divine Spirit. The Apocrypha and the Pseudepigrapha almost always merely echo the Old Testament portrayal of the Spirit of God. Since the intertestamental authors probably did not assume that the Divine Spirit had been fully removed from them, they wrote in the tradition of the Old Testament. They believed that the Spirit had worked among their ancestors. We could call that the historical tradition. That the Spirit, or wisdom, was available to them in the present, the wisdom tradition, and that the Spirit would be poured out on them in the future, the prophetic tradition. The eschatological aspect is often connected to the messianic expectation. The following chart visualizes the distribution of the historical wisdom and prophetic pneumatological traditions in the Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha. Note here that as you look at these strains of tradition, you have the historical tradition being seen in Judith and Wisdom, Jubilees, and First Enoch, the wisdom tradition being shown in Sirach, Wisdom of Solomon, especially the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs and First Enoch, and the prophetic tradition associated with the Spirit in Sirach and Wisdom, Testaments, Jubilees, First Enoch, and Psalms of Solomon, though not in Judith. From this, we can see that there is a greater distribution of the prophetic tradition in the intertestamental literatures that reference the Spirit than in others. Yet the quantity of wisdom and prophetic references to the divine Spirit is essentially the same. There is then more of a focus on the present, the wisdom tradition, and the future, the prophetic, or maybe we could say messianic, than on the past, historical. The Old Testament wisdom and prophetic traditions are occasionally extended and intertwined in the apocryphal and pseudepigraphal writings, which may have informed the pneumatology of the New Testament, especially that of Paul, Montag, and Isaacs. However, while the New Testament writers were probably familiar with the intertestamental literature, they seem to rely almost exclusively on the Old Testament, making direct dependence on the Apocrypha and the Pseudepigrapha unnecessary. Moreover, the possible affirmation of Sirach 48:24, and also to the previous with Elisha and Elijah, that the spirit of the prophet, apart from the Spirit of God, activated the ability to foretell the future, is foreign to the New Testament. See especially 2 Peter 1:20 and 21, and Ephesians 3:5. The literature of the intertestamental period grew out of the Old Testament. Even when the Jewish authors used foreign words, for example, anathema, they defined their terms per Old Testament pneumatology or theology. And when they expressed themselves in potentially ambiguous phrases, for instance, Wisdom 12:1, Testament of Judah 20:1 and 2, which could have looked stoic, they understood them in light of the Old Testament. Accordingly, when the New Testament uses similar language, preference ought to be given to the Jewish, not the Greco-Roman context. See Burton 206 to 207. The pre-Christian Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha seem to contribute little to New Testament pneumatology, since the Old Testament was the common source. The New Testament redefines and reinterprets the Spirit of God from the Old Testament, and even from the Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha, in new ways. The present study provides baseline data so that the similarities and differences between the intertestamental and Christian pneumatologies can be compared, and so that the setting out of which the New Testament pneumatology emerged can be identified. Additional research is needed, specifically research into the contributions of the Septuagint, the Dead Sea Scrolls, Philo, Josephus, and other Jewish literature to the pneumatological background of the New Testament. The examination of these Jewish sources will likely provide valuable insights into early Christian pneumatology. And below I have suggested readings. In the extended essay there are more sources, including more recent journal articles, but at this time I would invite Brother Dr. G to, if he's back, to continue, and I'd invite any questions and comments that you might have. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Marshall. Dr. G is not here, but we'll go ahead and see if there's any questions. I know Dr. Thompson's a scholar with Paul. Might have something as far as pneumatology in Paul or anything like that?
Well, I have a couple of questions.
Okay.
Your paper is on Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha. I notice you're pretty selective in which documents you cite. Fourth Ezra, Baruch, and other pseudepigraphic, Second Enoch, and others. What is the reason that you chose this particular selection?
In my methodology, I tried to determine as best I could when the sources were written, and tried to stay well before the advent of Christianity so that we would have more of a Jewish background without any influence of Christian sources to those writings.
Paul makes great use of the Ezekiel passage. I'll pour out my spirit. Ezekiel and Jeremiah. Did you find that in any of the documents that they were looking for the outpouring of the Spirit, a la Joel and Ezekiel?
Yes, sir. Especially in some of those messianic passages that may have, some of those may have had Christian influence, but the ones that seem to be looking for a Messiah that are more Jewish and pre-Christian, you see some of those echoes of the prophets, for instance, Isaiah and maybe even Ezekiel, that they were looking for some kind of messianic figure to come so that the Spirit could be outpoured and they could receive those blessings that had been stripped from them. There's an article or a couple of articles that I read in comparison to one another about how they felt about the Spirit having left them. And it's possible that, and you could confirm this from your reading if you know, that it's possible that they did not fully think that the Spirit had departed from Israel. Yes, there may have been a hint that the prophetic function, they were still awaiting the spirit of prophecy to return in that sense, but they still considered themselves the people of God, and thus they would have had the Spirit among them. And so they were looking for that final outpouring when they would receive all those blessings that are associated with the Joel passage. That seems to be underlying some of their expectation, at least in my reading.
You didn't find citations of the Joel passage or the Ezekiel passage about the pouring out of the Spirit in the future?
In the selected books that I had, I didn't see direct allusion, but that may be in some other apocryphal and pseudepigrapha books that were not in the selection that I had.
Okay.
In regard to the Ruach and the Spirit of God and all that, how do you differentiate between? I know you indicated that one leads to the other, and one's created or has initiated the life of the other. We come from that to the quote Godhead in the New Testament, where there seems to be distinctions made. But do you find it hard to make those kinds of distinctions in the Old Testament?
I do find it somewhat difficult at times. In fact, sometimes it seems like the breath of the Spirit has no personality at all, which would not be strange for in Old Testament times before the revelation of the New Testament to not expect to see personality. But one of the things that is difficult for me in distinguishing between these, and one solution I try to bring to it, is how does the rest of the Old Testament unveil and allude to that? And in that sense, some of the sources that I read that are not included in this condensed form and then are only briefly alluded to in the full paper, there seems to be some question even in the minds of the Jewish prophets at that time as to what is there a distinction between the breath and the Spirit of God and even the spirit of man? Did that kind of dualistic idea of man come at a later time? As I read the Old Testament, I still see this concept of a personal spirit that is given to man, but there's been a lot of articles, it seems to me, that have been written on, is that just an extension of God's own Spirit that is within us? And in that sense, when you have that blurring, even in the Old Testament, I have some difficulty trying to figure out which is which and whether or not we should even try to distinguish in certain passages between the breath, wind, or spirit. I guess the context would determine if this is a representation of God himself or if this is just supposed to be some kind of animating force.
I know in our doctoral class on advanced languages, their students are translating a lot, and so they come to the phrase "the Spirit of God," and most of them, I guess, always put a capital S there to signify a persona, personality, or something along that line. And I keep highlighting that, saying, is this contextually, being told that we're dealing with that kind of persona, or are you interpreting it that way? And that's one of the challenges, I think, that we have as translators in dealing with, either something that's personality, deity, or something that's, emanating, or, a different understanding of the Spirit of God. So,
And Pitts and Pollinger, they're writing on the intertestamental backgrounds of the New Testament, I guess Second Temple backgrounds of the New Testament. And I don't have the quote in the copy you have, but they have a point that I thought was significant, that they do not see necessarily a personality of the Spirit in the Old Testament, but often it is the instrumentality of God, or it is the extension of God Himself. And in that sense, I wouldn't always translate the Ruach with a capital S, but that it could still be emanating from God and thus be a representation of God, as it were, even if it is not the personality of the Holy Spirit that we understand in the New Testament. And in that sense, I did try to, in this paper, focus more on just the general concept of the divine Spirit without necessarily associating it with a personality, because I think that would be somewhat foreign to the Jewish writers.
Okay. I was looking up something, trying to get to my Dropbox here. Anything else? I'll probably have to get to this later, but I'll send it to you. Good job, appreciate it, man.
Thank you, appreciate you coming.
Appreciate the time you put into it. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Will, were you able to get that recorded?
Yeah, I got a
Okay,
recorder.
good. Very good.
I had a mini recorder, so I got it all recorded.
I guess you can hear us okay, right?